So now if you look at the camera, you need to smile because you'll be on camera. And let me go to the slides. Are they up on your screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, thank you. So as we went into war with Spain, initially, remember, we were fighting about Cuba. Cuba wanted to gain their independence just like we had done a little over 100 years before from Britain. But as we entered into that war, we also fought with Spain over the Philippines, which they controlled way over here in the Pacific Ocean near Japan. Japan's up here, China. So there was two, what we would call theaters of that war. You had an Atlantic Ocean theater and a Pacific Ocean theater. In Cuba, this war lasted 114 days. It didn't take us very long. And during this war, a young New York man, actually he was about in his late 30s, still young, but not 20-ish young, by the name of Theodore Roosevelt, was the leader of a special unit that he put together called the Rough Riders. If you've ever seen Night at the Museum, this is the character that Robin Williams plays, Teddy Roosevelt. And the Roosevelt that's in the movie is the one from the Rough Riders on his horse. As you remember, Ben Stiller becoming friends with him and helping him to eventually get a date with Pocahontas, right? Isn't that right? Or was it Sacagawea? I think it was Sacagawea in that movie. Anyway, the Rough Riders, they were this crew of Ivy League graduates, right? These were men that graduated from Harvard and Yale and Princeton. They were cowboys from out west where Teddy had been for a couple of years. He put this unit together and they were a pretty good, pretty effective unit in Cuba. And they helped to win that war in 114 days. If you ever do any personal study on the Spanish-American War, you'll hear about the battles of San Juan Hill, the, I think it's Kettle Hill. You'll hear about several battles on the southern part of the island, and they'll have the word hill in it because they were fought on these hills. Remember, part of the beginning of this war was our battleship, the USS Maine, exploded in the Havana Harbor on the north part of the island. And so we sent troops down and we put down the Spanish soldiers there in 114 days. So that was the theater in the Atlantic Ocean. In the Philippines, we attacked and destroyed Spain's fleet. And again, it was a fairly, it wasn't easy by any means, but compared to other wars, it was fairly short. And here's the irony of this war. We were fighting to help Cuba gain their independence from Spain. But here, after we defeated Spain over here, we decided to make the Philippines our own territory. We annexed them. Instead of saying, okay, to the Filipinos, you're free. It's now your country. We decided to say it's our territory. And eventually some Filipinos rebelled against us. And after we had gained the Philippines from Spain, we then entered into a 3-year war with the Filipinos, which was a very brutal war. And there is a good section in chapter 19 about that you need to read. This is what's ironic about that. We had fought ourselves against Britain to gain our independence, and now the Filipinos are fighting against us in the same type of war. But instead of backing off and saying, this is your nation, your island, your country, you're free, we did like England and we fought to keep it. Very, very ironic. But yet, across the ocean from the Pacific to the Atlantic, we promised Cuba to give them their independence. So some contradictory ways that the United States government was dealing with these different countries, smaller countries. But anyway, you can see that during this period that we call imperialism, remember we talked about how we had gotten Alaska. We have now basically from Spain, we gained Cuba, but we've promised that we're going to give them independence eventually. We also gained Puerto Rico from Spain. And then over here, we gained the Philippines and Guam. And you'll see here, we also gained the Wake Islands. So this idea that we are becoming a world power is because of this, because partly we're being imperialistic, where we're basically annexing and adding these territories to basically benefit our economy, our businessmen, the tycoons in the United States, and we're becoming imperialistic in a sense. Now we are seen as a world power around 1900. Any questions on that before we move to the final section of chapter 19? If you'll turn with me to page 701, I want you to know these 4 things that are in your textbook on the top of page 701. What these are the four ideas or 4 just 4 ideals or ideas that motivated our imperialism. So you need to know these for the test, top of page 701. First of all, there was a motive for national glory. This is kind of an egotistical motivation, but we want to be a player on the world scene. We want to be looked upon by other nations as a world power, and we want to be admired and for other countries to glorify us and envy us. And of course, we're talking about more of our government thinking this way. Remember, most of the population, they just wanted to live their lives out in the West, and those that have moved west, they just want to settle down and have a ranch or mine for gold or whatever it is. The second motivating idea was we want to expand our economic influence and expand our capitalistic marketplace. It'll benefit. Now, there was, within these motives, there were some altruistic strains within these motives, and that simply means altruistic is to do good, a desire to do good and help. So we wanted to see our economic interests be benefited, but also we wanted other people to enjoy the fruits of capitalism. And this was also affected by social Darwinism. Don't forget that. Social Darwinism, using that theory, many of the progressive presidents, starting with Teddy Roosevelt, who we're going to look at here in a little bit, they believed that the Anglo-Saxon race, Caucasians, were superior, and our civilization was, well, actually, it was a civilized civilization, and we needed to spread that around the world, our civilization, our government, democracy, and our religion, Christianity. Thirdly, and I just covered those next two things, we felt like we were superior as a race. And when we talk about racism back then, it doesn't mean the same thing it means today. To say that that whites were superior back then didn't mean that they hated all other races. It was more of an evolutionary belief. There are people who wrote books about how evolution, how the white race is the product of evolution and the survival of the fittest. And so it wasn't a hatred racism like we see today. It was just the way they viewed the world through Darwinism and through the Bible. Because you can see number 4 there, the desire to go out and gain new territories and spread capitalism was also accompanied by the desire to spread Christianity, to bring the gospel to heathens who were in spiritual darkness. That's the kind of, so those are the 4 motivating ideas for American imperialism. Know those 4 things for the test. Any questions before I move on to Teddy Roosevelt? I'm a big fan of Kevin James from The King of Queens and Here Comes the Boom, so I'll probably say question quite a bit, sorry. I used to watch, I remember watching about 10 years ago, noticing all the commercials about all these television shows like The King of Queens. There was a show called Still Standing. There was a show called According to Jim. And all of the husbands are kind of these bigger, huskier, rotund guys with all these beautiful wives. And I'm like, this can't be reality. These overweight guys. And then I had to think, oh my goodness, that's me and my life, my wife. Here I am, this rotund, I say husky, but a little bit overweight guy and beautiful wife. And okay, that is real life. Anyway, I know that just rivets you, but anyway, let's move on to Teddy Roosevelt. We love us some Teddy. Now, if I say that Teddy is one of the four of Rushmore, what do I mean?
He's one of the four presidents on Mount Rushmore.
Yes, very good. One of the four on Rushmore is Teddy Roosevelt. So our 26th president. Now, today we're just going to look at his imperialistic tendencies. But next week, as we get into chapter 20 and we get into the era of progressivism, we'll look at more of his political, some of his political policies at home in America, as well as his personal beliefs. But right now we're looking at him as far as his foreign policy and American imperialism. Roosevelt was quite an individual. And if you ever have to do a report in any class on a US president, or if you have to study somebody, if you ever take a leadership class, I would suggest you study Roosevelt. He was a leader.
Teachers, please bring the action.
Yeah.
For basketball pieces on February 15th.
Wait, don't need it?
Both teams do have to meet the client and turn in your information sheet as soon as possible. High school cheerleaders are hosting a dance on Friday night after the game. $3 per person,
Okay, I guess Cole went ahead and muted it for us. We'll wait a little bit till he gets done. Now, something I do as a pastor is I encourage young people in our church like you all whatever you do in life. Now, I'm not getting preachy here. This is very practical. Whatever you do in life, whatever you become. All right, Talahina's back.
Just go ahead.
Thank you for doing that.
welcome.
I was just sharing with the others that as a pastor, one thing that I tell the teenagers in my church, and this is not preachy, this is practical. But whatever you end up doing in life, whether you become a successful business person, or you become an engineer, or maybe you stay in your hometown and work locally and start a family, whatever you do, strive to be a leader and not a follower. Be a leader who influences people, and don't just be one who just goes with the crowd and follows along. Because we need more leaders. We need strong leaders. And if you ever do decide to do some leadership studies, study Teddy Roosevelt. He was born in New York. He had, I think, asthma problems. He was kind of a sickly child. But as he got into teenage years, he started to push himself, swimming, running, all kinds of exercise, and he built his strength and his immunity up. And as he grew into adulthood, he was an avid hunter, an outdoorsman. He was I think a wrestler in college. When he was president, he had on the second floor of the White House a boxing ring. He would box. Can you imagine being the guy who had to box the president? I mean, you didn't want to hurt him, but he's giving you an order. You must box me today. So he was a boxer, a wrestler, a hunter. He loved the outdoors. You know, we talked about the teddy bear story. He believed in the strenuous life, that you should push yourself and that'll make you stronger. And so after he graduated from college, he became a legislator in New York. When he was about 24, 25 years old, his mother and his wife died 11 hours apart from each other. His mom and then his first wife. So he left his baby girl with his sister and he went out west and he did some cowboying for 2 years. Came back to New York, ran for mayor, and he lost mayor of New York City. He became a field service commissioner for the federal government, or a civil service commissioner for 6 years. And then he became the New York City police commissioner for 2 years. Sometimes at night he would go out on the streets and he would have an officer walking down the street, and pretty soon the officer looks over and there's his commissioner walking with him, patrolling the streets. He eventually became the Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1896. When the Spanish-American War broke out, he wanted to go to war. So he did that in 1898, assembling the Rough Riders. Came back after the war, became governor of New York in 1898. In 1900, the people of New York encouraged him to be vice president, and especially the mafia bosses in New York City, because he was so tough on them. They could not buy him. So in 1900, he became vice president for William McKinley. And then 9 months after McKinley became president, on September 14th, 1901, McKinley died after being shot, and Roosevelt became president at age 42, the youngest president up to that time. When he became president at age 42, now I don't know if you guys keep up with the Democratic debates right now, but there's this guy named Pete Buttigieg, and he is like 38 years old, which means he's qualified because you have to be 35 to run for president. But he is like the youngest guy running for president right now. And one of the things that all the other people kind of criticize him for is he doesn't have enough experience. He's too young. All he's done is been mayor of a city in Indiana, and he is a military veteran. Well, when Teddy became president at 42, he had more experience than most presidents have had when they came into office. A legislature, police commissioner, assistant secretary of the Navy, governor, vice president. I mean, he has had all kinds of experience. And when Teddy becomes president, he brings in a theory about the presidency that is new. He brings in the strong presidency theory. Before Teddy, most presidents were happy to go along with the stewardship theory of the presidency. The stewardship theory simply said that the presidency is just basically, it's an office of being a steward where you try to go in and serve, and you try to work with the Congress, and Congress has more power. And Teddy came in and totally changed that. He said the presidency is a bully pulpit and you should use it to help people. And so he believed in a strong, active, on-hands presidency. And so he supports federal government, the role of federal government when the states do not solve problems that have to deal with the nation's welfare. That's why one of your assignments is to do the discussion over the 1902 coal strike and how Teddy Roosevelt handled that. But we're going to stick within the limits of foreign policy and imperialism. And one of the first things that Teddy dealt with was the Panama Canal. There it is again, Panama. So you're welcome, Spyro. Panama is down here in Central America. And since the late 1800s, we were wanting a canal to be constructed that would connect the Gulf of Mexico with the Pacific Ocean. Because look at this map here. Right now, if you were leaving New York City up here, and you're on your big freight ship, and let's say you're going to ship some beautiful pine trees from New Hampshire all the way to San Francisco. You have to sail all the way around South America, and then up the coast and all the way up, 8,000 miles. But if we can get a canal right here, we can ship those pine trees a lot faster and save a lot of time and save money. So again, what makes the world go around?
Money.
Money. So let's get the canal built, save money, great economic opportunity. So things had kind of slowed down and got bogged down, and Teddy comes in and he gets things done. One thing that had happened was Colombia right here, they were in control of this area of Panama. And at the time that Teddy became president, a French company was digging the canal. Well, the US bought what the French had been doing. And then with Teddy leading the way, we negotiated with Colombia to get the canal finished. And eventually things got bad between us and Colombia. Well, Panama decided to rebel against Colombia, and we helped them And so Panama gained their independence. Then we signed a treaty where we would pay them $10 million for the canal zone, plus every year we will give them $250,000 for the rest of history. So that's, and what that means is we would control the canal zone. $10 million plus $250,000 a year. So Teddy got that brokered, and by 1914, the Panama Canal was completed. So it's been done for 106 years. 106 years. Now that led into what Roosevelt called big stick diplomacy. One of his favorite sayings was an African proverb: speak softly and carry. Anybody? Bueller? Carry a big stick. And so the way he approached foreign policy was called big stick diplomacy. Not so much bullying, but in a sense, bullying. Back in 1823, President Monroe had established a doctrine that said no longer can European countries come over here and mess with South American countries or Central American countries. That was called the Monroe Doctrine. The United States will not allow European countries to have affairs with these countries. Well, when Teddy came along, he added a corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said, we will use military power to basically be a police force for the Western Hemisphere. So this was a bit part of his big stick diplomacy. Another part of it was the Great White Fleet. By the time of Teddy's second presidency, 1904 to 1908, our Navy had become the second greatest Navy on the planet behind Britain. Anybody planning on going into the Navy? Okay, so during his second term, Teddy sent the Great White Fleet basically on a world tour. So before Van Halen and Taylor Swift and whoever people are today who sing, before they had world tours, we sent our Navy on this world tour around the world, 16 battleships to show off how powerful we were. So that's another part of Teddy's big stick diplomacy. Basically, show them how mighty we are. Here's a popular cartoon which is in your textbook. It shows Teddy walking around the Caribbean Ocean, or the Caribbean Sea, Mexico, Panama, Venezuela. He's got his big stick. He's got his Great White Fleet behind him. And this is just a political cartoon to show how Teddy approached the foreign relations with, especially those in the Western Hemisphere. But again, we were also protecting our economic interests. We wanted to trade with Venezuela, Panama, Mexico, Cuba. We had people who had businesses there. So we were also protecting our economic interests. Very quickly, two presidents that followed Roosevelt and continued the imperialism, William Taft. But instead of Taft using basically military might and a big stick, he approached it with what was called dollar diplomacy. Basically, Taft would protect our U.S. economic interests in especially the Caribbean nations.
No, this is what we usually do.
Taft urged our banks and our businesses to invest in Latin America. And if anything threatened any of those Latin American countries, Taft had promised to intervene. The U.S. would intervene. So his was if you look here, a passive imperialism. And then we want to talk about Woodrow Wilson very quickly. He became president after Taft, and he had what historians call a moral diplomacy or a missionary diplomacy. Tell me what is right and I will fight for it, Woodrow Wilson. This cartoon kind of summarizes how Wilson approached his relationships with other foreign powers. He wanted to avoid war. He wanted to avoid intervening, and he was sailing for justice, to do what is right. It was called, as I said, either moral or missionary diplomacy. Basically, America would be the teacher of the world. We would teach them about how to basically do government. We would spread democracy. We would promote peace. And we would only use the military to fix problems as a last resort. So any questions on the growing pain of imperialism? All right, I will have a video up on Friday that you'll need to watch for the weekend. That will be your supplemental assignment since we don't meet on Fridays. And be prepared to dive into chapter 20 on Monday morning, President's Day. No questions, we will see you then. And I will have the slides and video up in a couple of hours.